The penthouse wasn't a home. It was a vault, soundproofed, temperature-controlled, and decorated in shades of cold marble and expensive restraint. A prison designed to look like a dream. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan's icy, unforgiving waters, but the beauty was a lie. Behind those reinforced glass panels, Elias Vance had learned that silence was survival. Every surface gleamed with the kind of pristine perfection that only came from obsessive maintenance, from servants who were paid well enough to never speak of what they saw, and from an Omega who had learned to scrub away the evidence of his own suffering before the sun rose. For 3 agonizing years, Elias had bled behind locked doors. To the outside world, Elias and Marcus Sterling were the golden couple of Chicago's elite. Marcus was a charismatic real estate mogul whose smile graced the covers of local business magazines, a man whose handshake could disarm a boardroom and charm socialites at Drake Hotel charity galas. He had the kind of easy confidence that came from generations of wealth and the ruthless ambition to multiply it. Elias, with his sharp cheekbones, quiet elegance, and the subtle grace of a well-bred Omega, was the perfect accessory on his arm. The young husband who never spoke out of turn, who laughed at the right moments, whose designer suits always matched Marcus's tie. They lived in a sprawling $10 million penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood, a monument to wealth and success that overlooked the restless, churning waters of Lake Michigan. The penthouse had 3 bedrooms, a home theater, a wine cellar stocked with bottles worth more than most people's cars, and a private elevator that ensured no one could enter without Marcus's explicit permission. But the penthouse wasn't a home. It was a soundproofed mausoleum where Elias's screams went to die, swallowed by the thick walls and the relentless hum of the city far below. The marble floors were always cold against his bare feet. The floor-to-ceiling windows always seemed to mock him with the freedom he couldn't access, and the expensive art on the walls was nothing but a gilded reminder of the cage he was trapped in. The abuse began 6 weeks after their lavish wedding in 2020. It started small, a shattered wine glass, a vicious reproach over a misplaced set of keys, a tightly gripped wrist that left faint yellowing bruises Elias had to cover with expensive silk shirts. Marcus was a master of psychological warfare, a man who had honed his cruelty to an art form. He isolated Elias methodically, systematically cutting off his ties to his sister in Seattle and his former colleagues at the architecture firm where he used to work. Every phone call was monitored, every email screened, every visit from a friend met with Marcus's cold fury later that night. By the end of their first year, Elias's world had shrunk to the cold marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows of their apartment. Friends stopped calling. Family stopped visiting. Even the doormen stopped meeting his eyes, turning away as if they couldn't bear to witness what was happening behind those gilded walls. By the second year, the violence escalated from outbursts to calculated beatings. Marcus was careful never to hit Elias in the face, where the country club wives might see, where his business associates might notice the telltale signs of abuse. But his ribs, his back, his thighs, they became a tragic canvas of Marcus's rage, a tapestry of purple and black that Elias had to hide under layers of expensive fabric. When Marcus shattered Elias's collarbone in the winter of 2021, he drove him to Northwestern Memorial Hospital himself, his hand resting warmly on Elias's knee in the waiting room. He told Dr. Harrison, a respected orthopedic surgeon, that Elias had slipped on the icy marble steps of their foyer. The doctor nodded sympathetically, his eyes never quite meeting Elias's. Elias, terrified of the alpha holding his hand, corroborated the lie with dead, hollow eyes, his Omega instincts screaming at him to submit, to comply, to survive. The scent of Marcus's cologne was overwhelming, a reminder of the punishment that awaited if he dared to speak the truth. The third year was when the true nightmare began. Marcus was drowning in debt, catastrophic investments in a commercial district development in the South Loop, leveraging money he didn't have, gambling on properties that were never going to appreciate. When the banks finally cut him off, Marcus turned to the shadows. He turned to the Chicago syndicate, borrowing money from people who didn't offer second chances. As the pressure mounted, his sanity frayed. He was drinking heavily, draining bottles of Macallan 25 by the hour, and his paranoia reached fever pitches. Elias became his punching bag, the sole outlet for his mounting terror, the scapegoat for every failure and every fear. Marcus installed cameras in the penthouse, tiny blinking eyes that watched Elias's every move. He tracked the GPS on Elias's phone, demanding to know where he had been if he so much as went to the corner store. He monitored his heart rate through his smartwatch, accusing him of conspiring against him if it spiked while he was out. There was no escape. There was no respite. There was only the endless, grinding cycle of fear and pain and the desperate hope that someday, somehow, it would end. November 14th, 2023, was a Tuesday. The city was being lashed by an unseasonal violent thunderstorm, the kind that made the news and sent the homeless scrambling for shelter. Rain hammered against the reinforced glass of the penthouse like bullets, the lightning illuminating the sky in violent, jagged flashes that turned the world into a nightmare landscape. Elias was in the kitchen, his hands shaking as he poured a cup of tea, trying to brace himself for what he knew was coming. He had learned to read the signs. The way Marcus's footsteps sounded on the marble, the subtle changes in his scent, the tension in his shoulders. He knew the signs, and they all pointed to disaster. Marcus's car had pulled into the private garage downstairs, and the concierge had called up to announce him, his voice carefully neutral, as if he couldn't hear the fear in Elias's own. The familiar dread coiled in Elias's stomach, a serpent that had made its home there years ago, a constant companion that never left his side. When the private elevator doors opened, Marcus didn't just walk out. He stormed out, bringing the smell of stale scotch, wet wool, and pure, unadulterated panic with him. His tie was undone, his eyes bloodshot and wild, his hair disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it for hours. He looked like a man possessed, a demon wearing an expensive suit, his fury radiating off him in waves that made Elias's omega instincts scream in primal terror. "Where is it?" he screamed, his voice tearing through the quiet apartment like a blade. The sound echoed off the marble floors, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner of the space. The teacup in Elias's hand rattled against the saucer. "Where's what, Marcus?" Elias whispered, stepping back, his back hitting the cold granite of the kitchen island. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, a frantic drumbeat that seemed to echo the rain outside. "The ledger. The encrypted drive I left in the safe. It's gone." Marcus's eyes were wild, his pupils dilated with terror and rage. He lunged across the room, his heavy hand connecting violently with Elias's jaw. The impact sent Elias sprawling to the floor, his vision exploding into brilliant white stars. The teacup shattered, sending scalding water and jagged porcelain across the tiles. He tasted copper immediately, the familiar metallic tang of blood filling his mouth, mixing with the bitter taste of fear. "I don't know the combination to the safe, Marcus." "You know I don't," he sobbed, curling into a protective ball, his arms wrapping around his head, his knees drawing up to his chest. It was a position he had learned through bitter experience, one that minimized the damage, that protected the most vulnerable parts of his body. He had perfected it over 3 years, and it had saved him more times than he could count. Marcus didn't listen. The beating that followed was the worst Elias had ever endured, a torrent of violence that seemed to have no end. For 20 minutes, the penthouse echoed with the sickening thuds of his boots and Elias's muffled screams, the sounds swallowed by the soundproofed walls. He was punishing Elias, but he was also terrified, acting out the violence he knew was coming for him, venting his fear and rage on the only person he could control. His ribs cracked, the sharp pain radiating through his entire body. His vision blurred, tears and blood mixing on his face. As he lay bleeding on the white marble floor, staring at the flashing lightning outside the window, Elias closed his eyes and finally prayed for death. He was ready. 3 years of hell was enough. He had fought so hard, had endured so much, but there was nothing left in him. His father was dead. His family was gone. His friends had abandoned him. He had no one, nothing, and the man who was supposed to love him was slowly killing him. Elias let go, surrendering to the darkness that was calling him, welcoming the release that had been so long in coming. But death didn't come. Instead, there was a sound so deeply out of place that it made Marcus freeze mid-strike, his fist hovering in the air like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The sudden silence was deafening, more terrifying than the violence had been. Knock, knock, knock. Heavy, rhythmic, demanding. Someone was at the front door? No one knocked on the door of the penthouse. Visitors were vetted by the lobby concierge, screened by security, and brought up via the private elevator. The stairwell doors were magnetically locked, accessible only by keycard. For someone to be standing in their hallway, they would have had to bypass 3 layers of state-of-the-art security without setting off a single alarm. It was impossible. And yet, the knocking continued, a sound so out of place that it seemed to come from another world. Marcus turned pale. The rage in his eyes instantly dissolved into absolute, paralyzing dread, a fear so profound that it seemed to sap the strength from his limbs. He backed away from Elias's broken body, his chest heaving, his hands suddenly trembling as if he were the victim, not the perpetrator. The color drained from his face, leaving him ashen and ghost-like, a hollow shell of the man he had been moments before. Knock, knock, knock. Marcus! A voice called from the other side of the heavy oak door. It was a smooth, calm baritone, carrying a distinct East Coast cadence. The voice of a man who was used to being obeyed, who had never had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. We know you're in there, Marcus. You missed our meeting at the harbor. That was very rude. Marcus stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the shattered porcelain on the floor. No, he whimpered, his voice cracking, his bravado crumbling into pathetic terror. No, no, no. Not yet. I have until Friday. He scrambled to the console table, pulling open a drawer and withdrawing a sleek black 9mm handgun. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the magazine before slamming it into the grip, his fumbling fingers betraying his panic. Marcus, I'm not going to ask again, the calm voice outside warned. Open the door, or my associates will remove it from its hinges. It's a beautiful door. Custom mahogany, right? It would be a shame. Marcus pointed the gun at the door, but he didn't shoot. He was paralyzed, frozen by a terror that far exceeded anything he had ever inflicted on Elias. He had never been on this side of fear, had never understood what it felt like to be helpless, and the realization was destroying him. Then came a deafening crack. The reinforced deadbolt didn't just break. The entire wooden frame splintered inward with explosive force as a massive, broad-shouldered man kicked it open. The heavy mahogany door slammed against the interior wall, leaving a dent in the drywall, splinters flying across the room. The sound was like a gunshot, reverberating through the penthouse, shaking the very foundations. 3 men stepped into the penthouse. The 2 on the flanks were muscle, hulking, silent men in dark suits with broken noses and cold, dead eyes. They moved with the practiced ease of men who had done this 1,000 times before, their hands resting casually on the grips of their holstered weapons. But the man in the center commanded the entire room the second he crossed the threshold, his presence so overwhelming that it seemed to fill every corner of the space. Dante Rossi was 36 years old, the underboss of the Rossi crime family, and a ghost to the FBI. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal 3-piece suit that clung to his broad, athletic frame, the fabric perfectly tailored to emphasize his powerful build. His dark hair was combed back, his sharp jawline shadowed by a faint scruff that only added to his dangerous appeal. But it was his eyes that froze the blood in Elias's veins. They were a striking, icy blue, entirely devoid of mercy, the color of a winter sky before a blizzard. He looked like a man who had seen the depths of hell and decided he could run it better. His scent filled the room, cedar, rain, and gunpowder, undercut by something darker, something that spoke of violence and control. It was the scent of an alpha who was used to getting exactly what he wanted, who had never been denied anything in his life. Dante stepped casually over the splintered wood, his hands resting easily in his pockets. He ignored the gun shaking in Marcus's hand completely, as if it were no more threatening than a child's toy. His gaze swept across the penthouse with an expression of mild disdain, as if he were appraising a piece of property that had failed to meet his expectations. Marcus, Dante sighed, glancing around the opulent living room with a look of utter boredom. 10 million for this view, and the roof still leaks. You really shouldn't have stiffed the contractors on the drywall. His voice was conversational, almost bored, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the life or death situation unfolding around him. Dominic, listen to me, Marcus stammered, his voice cracking, his bravado completely gone. I have the money. I just need 48 hours. The South Loop zoning permits are clearing tomorrow. I can liquidate the offshore accounts. You owe my uncle $4.2 million, Marcus. Dante interrupted, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. You missed 3 payments. You ignored my phone calls. And then you tried to book a private charter out of Midway Airport to Costa Rica 2 hours ago. Dante tilted his head, his icy eyes narrowing with a dangerous amusement. Did you really think I wouldn't know? Marcus's face went chalk white, the blood draining so completely that he looked like a corpse. The gun wavered in his grip, his hands trembling so badly that the barrel traced erratic patterns in the air, pointing at nothing and everything at once. I was just going to secure the funds. It was then that Dante's icy gaze drifted down. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, his words dying in his throat. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted, the temperature plummeting like a sudden Arctic front. The casual amusement vanished from his face, replaced by something far more dangerous. Dante saw Elias. He was huddled against the base of the kitchen island, his face bruised and swollen, blood trailing from his nose and lip, his eye already swelling shut. His clothes were torn, his expensive silk shirt ripped open to reveal the mottled purple and black bruises covering his chest, the unmistakable pattern of boot prints on his ribs. He was shaking violently, clutching his shattered ribs, his omega instincts screaming at him to submit, to appease, to survive. The scent of his distress, fear, pain, and the unmistakable pheromones of a badly injured omega filled the air like a scream, overwhelming everything else in the room. Dante's posture changed. The casual, relaxed mob boss vanished in an instant, replaced by a coiled predator. His shoulders squared, his jaw tightened, and something dark and dangerous flickered behind his icy eyes. He stared at Elias, a strange, terrifying intensity burning in his gaze. He didn't look at him with pity. Pity was for the weak, the helpless. He looked at him with a raw, visceral fury that seemed to fill the entire room. Who did this? Dante asked. The question was spoken so quietly it was almost a whisper, yet it echoed louder than Marcus's shouting. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, suffocating. That has nothing to do with this, Marcus stammered, misreading the room entirely. He lowered the gun slightly, desperate to bargain, to find some way out of the trap he had walked into. Dante, please. The debt. Take the penthouse. Take the cars in the garage. I'll sign over the deeds right now. Dante didn't look at Marcus. He took slow, deliberate steps across the room until he was standing just a few feet away from Elias, close enough to touch. The 2 massive enforcers at the door shifted, their hands resting on the grips of their holstered weapons, eyes locked on Marcus. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing that coiled around them all, ready to strike. I asked. Dante repeated, his voice dropping an octave, a low growl that vibrated through the air. Who did this to him? Marcus swallowed hard, the panic making him reckless. He's my husband. He fell. It's none of your business, Dante. Please, listen to my offer. The house. The house is already ours, Marcus, Dante said coldly, his voice flat and emotionless. We put the lien on it this morning. The cars are impounded. Your bank accounts were frozen by my people at noon. You have nothing. You are nothing. Marcus fell to his knees, dropping the gun. It clattered against the hardwood floor, the sound obscenely loud in the silence that had fallen over the penthouse. He was sobbing now, a pathetic, sniveling mess, his expensive suit soaked with rainwater and tears. The alpha who had tormented Elias for 3 years, who had broken his bones and shattered his spirit, was reduced to a crying child, his power utterly evaporated. Please, Marcus begged, crawling forward on his hands and knees, his tears mixing with the rainwater and spilled tea on the floor. I'll do anything. I'll work for you. I have connections at City Hall. I have him. Elias's heart stopped. He stared at his husband in absolute disbelief, the betrayal cutting deeper than any physical blow ever could. After everything, after 3 years of hell, this was how Marcus saw him. Not as a person, not as a partner, but as a commodity to be traded, a thing to be used. Marcus pointed a trembling finger at Elias, his eyes wide with manic desperation. Take him. You like him. He's yours. Use him to pay off the interest. Rent him out. Do whatever you want with him. Just let me walk away. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the penthouse. The only sound was the rain lashing against the glass and Marcus's pathetic sobs. One of Dante's enforcers, a man named Enzo, let out a low, disgusted breath, his hand tightening on his weapon. Even hardened killers had a code. Even they knew that some lines were never crossed. The contempt in Enzo's eyes was almost palpable, a silent judgment on the pathetic creature groveling on the floor. Dante didn't blink. He slowly turned his head to look at Marcus, who was kneeling in a puddle of spilled tea and rainwater, his sobs echoing off the high ceilings. For a long moment, Dante just stared at the pathetic creature on the floor, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, agonizingly long, as if Dante were weighing Marcus's soul and finding it utterly wanting. Then Dante reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Marcus flinched, waiting for the bullet. Instead, Dante pulled out a pristine white linen handkerchief, carefully folded, utterly immaculate. He crouched down, his expensive leather shoes resting on the blood-stained tiles. He ignored Marcus completely, bringing himself down to Elias's eye level. Up close, Elias could smell him, cedar, rain, and gunpowder, undercut by something warmer, something that made his omega instincts pulse with confusion. He didn't touch Elias. He simply held out the handkerchief, his hand steady and sure. His icy blue eyes met Elias's terrified brown ones, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. 3 years ago, Elias. Dante spoke directly to him, his voice astonishingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence that had filled the room moments before. I sat in the back row of a cathedral and watched you marry a man I knew was a parasite. I wondered how long it would take for the golden cage to rust. Elias gasped, the pain in his ribs forgotten as shock washed over him. He knew his name. He was at his wedding. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. Take the handkerchief, Tesoro, Dante murmured. Wipe your face. Because the Omega who walks out of this penthouse with me tonight is not a victim. He is going to be the reason this city burns. Elias's trembling hand reached out, his bruised fingers brushing against the crisp white linen. It felt absurdly soft against the harsh reality of his bloodied skin. As he pressed it to his split lip, the scent of cedar and rain enveloped him, grounding his chaotic thoughts. Dante's icy blue eyes held his, unflinching and devoid of the pity he had come to loathe. There was something else in them, something fierce and protective that Elias had never seen before. How do you know my name? Elias whispered, his voice rasping in the quiet of the shattered penthouse. Arthur Pendleton was a good man. Dante said softly, the mention of Elias's maiden name sending a jolt through his spine. Your father was one of the few honest judges in Cook County. When my grandfather was facing a rigged indictment orchestrated by a corrupt district attorney 10 years ago, your father threw the case out. He didn't take a bribe. He just looked at the law and did what was right, knowing it would cost him his political career. Dante paused, his jaw tightening. The Rossi family does not forget a debt, and we do not forgive a betrayal. Behind them, Marcus was still on his knees in the puddle of rainwater, his pathetic sobs echoing off the high ceilings. He looked between Dante and Elias, realization slowly dawning on his terror-stricken face. You, Marcus stammered, wiping snot from his nose with the back of his trembling hand. You planned this. You trapped me. The zoning permits, the union strikes on the South Loop project, that was you. You orchestrated my bankruptcy. Dante stood up slowly, the fluid grace of a predator returning to its full height. He turned to face Marcus, the brief warmth he had shown Elias vanishing instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating mask of a mob boss. His eyes were flat, dead, utterly devoid of mercy. I merely accelerated the inevitable, Marcus, Dante stated, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. You are a greedy, incompetent fool. You borrowed money you couldn't lend, invested in properties you couldn't develop, and tried to pay off my uncle with empty promises. But that is just business. I deal with idiots every day. Dante took a slow, deliberate step toward the kneeling man. What makes you special, Marcus, is that you are a coward. A coward who hides behind a $10 million mortgage while he beats an Omega who weighs a fraction of what he does. Dante gestured to the shattered porcelain on the floor. And a coward who kills his father-in-law for an inheritance. Elias stopped breathing. The pain in his ribs vanished, replaced by an icy, paralyzing shock that froze him to his core. What did you say? He gasped, his voice barely audible. Marcus recoiled as if he had been physically struck, his face draining of whatever color remained, leaving him a sickly gray. No, that was an accident. The police report said black ice on Interstate 90. He lost control of his sedan. Dante gestured casually to the hulking enforcer on his left. Enzo. Enzo reached into the inner pocket of his dark suit and retrieved a small metallic rectangle, a silver USB drive. Elias recognized it instantly. It was the encrypted drive Marcus had been tearing the penthouse apart to find, the drive that had started this entire nightmare. You see, Elias, Dante said, his gaze fixed on Marcus's horrified face. Marcus here is not just a monster. He's an arrogant one. He likes to keep trophies. He likes leverage. When my men quietly cracked the safe in your study this morning while Marcus was out trying to beg for a loan, we expected to find our missing ledger. We found it. But we also found audio recordings, bank transfers to a mechanic in Skokie who specialized in cutting brake lines, emails detailing how to funnel Arthur Pendleton's life insurance and estate directly into a failing real estate holding company. The room spun. Elias gripped the edge of the granite kitchen island, pulling himself up. His legs shook, but a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline coursed through his veins. 3 years ago, he had lost his father in a tragic winter crash. It was the grief that had driven him into Marcus's arms, seeking the protection and comfort he had so flawlessly faked. He had played the grieving, supportive fiancé perfectly, whispering sweet lies in Elias's ear while plotting to destroy everything he loved. He hadn't just caged Elias. He had slaughtered the only family he had left to build the cage. Elias, sweetie, please, Marcus begged, his voice high-pitched and hysterical as he crawled toward him, ignoring the mobsters in the room. He's lying. He's a criminal, a murderer. You can't listen to him. I love you. I did everything for us. Before Marcus could reach him, Dante moved. It was terrifyingly fast. Dante's heavy leather shoe slammed into Marcus's chest, sending the developer sprawling backward onto the hard marble floor. Marcus gasped for air, clutching his sternum, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Dante stepped over him, his foot coming to rest heavily on Marcus's throat, pinning him to the ground. Do not speak to him, Dante commanded, his voice a low, lethal growl that rumbled through the room. Do not look at him. You lost the right to speak his name the first time you laid a hand on him. Dante looked over his shoulder at Elias. The drive has everything, Elias. The financial fraud, the embezzlement, and the undeniable proof of your father's murder. Tomorrow morning, a courier will deliver copies to the FBI, the IRS, and the Chicago Police Department. But before the law gets to him, I need to know what you want me to do with him tonight. Marcus whimpered beneath Dante's boot, his eyes rolling back in terror. The alpha who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was reduced to a quivering mess, his life in the hands of the man he had tried to cheat. Elias stared down at the man who had been his husband, his jailer, his torturer. He saw the blood on his own hands, felt the sharp, agonizing pain in his shattered ribs. He remembered the nights locked in the closet, the gaslighting, the psychological torment that had stripped away his identity until he was nothing but a ghost haunting his own life. He remembered his father's face, kind and warm, the only person who had ever truly loved him, and the way Marcus had smiled when he heard the news of the accident. He looked at Dante, a ruthless, dangerous alpha who stood in his living room like a dark, avenging angel, a man who had just given him back his life. I want him to lose everything, Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady, ringing clear over the sound of the storm outside. I want him to be stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his freedom. But I don't want him dead, Mr. Rossi. Death is a release. I want him to spend the rest of his miserable life in a concrete box, looking over his shoulder, knowing that the man who put him there is untouchable. I want him to live in fear, exactly like I did. A slow, dark smile spread across Dante's face. It was a terrifyingly beautiful expression, one that transformed his features into something almost angelic. He removed his foot from Marcus's throat. Enzo Leo, Dante said smoothly. Take the garbage out. Bring him to the warehouse by the docks. Make sure he understands exactly who he belongs to before we hand him over to the federal authorities on Monday. He paused, his eyes glinting with cold amusement. Oh, and Enzo, break his hands. Both of them. Clumsy people shouldn't handle real estate. No. Dante, please, Elias. Marcus screamed as the two massive enforcers hauled him off the floor by his armpits. He thrashed and kicked, but he was nothing against their brute strength, his expensive shoes scuffing the marble, his screams echoing down the private hallway until the elevator doors closed, cutting off his cries abruptly. The penthouse was suddenly, deafeningly quiet. The only sounds were the rain lashing against the windows and Elias's ragged, uneven breathing. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, there was only silence. Dante turned back to Elias. He didn't rush him. He didn't invade his space. He simply extended a hand, palm open, waiting for Elias to make the choice himself. Come with me, Elias, he said gently, his voice soft and reassuring. There is a car waiting downstairs and a private doctor at my estate who won't ask questions. Your time in the dark is over. Elias looked at his outstretched hand. It was the hand of a criminal, a man who commanded violence with a simple nod, a man who had just broken another man's hands without a flicker of remorse. But as he placed his bruised, trembling fingers into Dante's warm, calloused palm, Elias knew one undeniable truth. He had never felt safer in his entire life. The drive to the Rossi estate in Lake Forest was a blur of rain-streaked windows and silent tension. Elias sat in the back of a black SUV, Dante beside him, the Alpha's presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the storm. Enzo drove, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds, while Leo sat in the passenger seat, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm, struggling against the torrential downpour. Elias couldn't stop shaking. His ribs screamed with every breath, and the metallic taste of blood still lingered in his mouth. But it wasn't the pain that consumed him, it was the silence. 3 years of walking on eggshells, of anticipating the next blow, of being told he was worthless, crazy, imagining things. And now, in the space of an hour, everything had been ripped away. The world as he knew it had been turned upside down, and he didn't know what to feel. Relief warred with grief, fear with hope. Your scent is changing, Dante said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost contemplative, as if he were thinking out loud. It was sharp with fear before. Now it's... He paused, his nostrils flaring slightly as he catalogued the pheromones emanating from Elias. Confused. Overwhelmed. You don't know what to feel, do you? Elias flinched, instinctively trying to pull away. Omegas weren't supposed to have obvious scent tells. It was a vulnerability, a weakness predators could exploit. Marcus had drilled that into him for years, punishing him whenever his emotions leaked through, teaching him to suppress every natural instinct. Don't do that, Dante said, his tone soft but firm. Don't hide from me. I'm not going to hurt you. How can I believe that? Elias whispered, his voice cracking. You're a mob boss. You just broke into my home and rescued you, Dante finished. Yes, I am a mob boss. I have done terrible things, Elias. I have blood on my hands, and I will do terrible things again. But I have never... He stopped, his jaw tightening. I have never raised a hand to an Omega. I have never taken what wasn't freely offered. And I have never, in my entire life, looked at someone who was broken and thought they deserved it. Elias stared at him, searching for the lie. He found none. I'm not offering you a cage, Dante continued. I'm offering you a choice. You can stay at my estate until you're healed, and then you can go anywhere you want. I'll give you money, connections, whatever you need to start over. Or, he paused, his icy blue eyes meeting Elias's. You can stay, not as a prisoner, not as a possession, as someone who belongs. Elias's heart pounded. Belongs to you. Belongs with me, Dante corrected. There's a difference. I don't want a pet, Elias. I want a partner. Someone who understands that the world is a brutal, unforgiving place, and that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. The rest of the drive passed in silence, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of Marcus's penthouse. It was the kind of silence that held possibility, like the breath before a storm breaks. Elias found himself studying Dante's profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed absently against his knee, the subtle tension in his shoulders. He was handsome in a way that was almost painful, the kind of beauty that promised danger and pleasure in equal measure. There was something about him that drew Elias in, something that made him want to trust, even when every instinct told him to be careful. The Rossi estate was a sprawling fortress of stone and glass, hidden behind acres of dense forest. It was designed not for comfort, but for survival. High walls, motion sensors, armed guards patrolling the perimeter, security cameras at every angle. But inside it was warm. Soft lighting, expensive furniture, and the faint scent of wood smoke and cinnamon. It smelled like home, though Elias couldn't quite articulate why. The private doctor, a beta named Dr. Chun, arrived within minutes. She patched up Elias's ribs, stitched the gash above his eyebrow, and prescribed a strong anti-inflammatory and painkillers. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look at him with pity. She simply did her job and left, her expression carefully neutral. Dante showed Elias to a guest room on the second floor, a spacious suite with a king-sized bed, a fireplace, and windows that overlooked the snowy forest. The room was decorated in warm earth tones, with soft blankets and plush pillows that looked almost obscenely comfortable. It was a far cry from the cold marble and sharp edges of the penthouse. Rest, Dante said, lingering in the doorway. There's a panic button by the bed. The door locks from the inside. No one will enter without your permission. Elias nodded, too exhausted to speak. His body was screaming with pain, and the adrenaline that had carried him through the night was finally beginning to fade. Dante turned to leave, then paused. Elias. Yes. What you did in that penthouse, telling me what you wanted, standing up to the man who hurt you. That took more courage than most alphas I know have ever shown. I want you to know that. He met Elias's eyes, his gaze holding a fierce, unexpected tenderness. You are not broken. You are forged. And then he was gone, the door clicking softly shut behind him. Elias stared at the closed door for a long moment, then sank onto the bed, burying his face in the silk pillow. For the first time in 3 years, he let himself cry. Not from pain, not from fear, but from relief. The weight that had been crushing his chest for 1,000 days finally began to lift. The days that followed were strange, surreal. Elias spent the first week in a fog of painkillers and trauma, sleeping for 12 hours at a time, waking only to eat the meals that were left outside his door. Dante kept his distance, but Elias could feel his presence in the house. The rumble of his voice in the study, the scent of cedar and rain that lingered in the hallways, the subtle reassurance that he was not alone. It was a strange comfort, knowing that someone was watching over him, even from a distance. Gradually, Elias began to emerge. He started taking meals in the dining room, sitting across from Dante in the cavernous space. They talked about inconsequential things at first, the weather, the food, the estate's extensive library. But slowly, the conversations deepened. Dante told him about his childhood, about the weight of being born into a crime family, about the violence he had witnessed and the violence he had committed. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't apologize for it. He simply laid it out, brutal and honest. "I don't want you to think I'm a good man," Dante said one evening, swirling a glass of bourbon. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across his sharp features. "I'm not. I have done things that would make you sick. I have killed people, Elias. Men and women who deserved it. Yes, but also people who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I carry that with me. I always will." Elias studied him across the table, his omega instincts humming with an awareness he couldn't quite name. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want there to be any illusions between us." Dante's gaze was steady, unwavering. "You've lived with a monster who pretended to be a saint. I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not." Elias nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." Dante's lips curved into a small, sad smile. "You're the first person who's ever said that." 3 weeks into his stay, Elias found himself in the estate's private gym, watching Enzo demonstrate a basic self-defense technique. The bruising on his ribs had faded to a dull ache, and Dr. Chun had cleared him for light physical activity. The gym was state-of-the-art, with everything from free weights to a boxing ring, and Enzo had been surprisingly patient in teaching him the basics. "You're tense," Enzo observed, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You're expecting to be hit." Elias flinched. It's okay." Enzo stepped back, giving him space. "You've been conditioned. That's not your fault. But if you're going to learn how to protect yourself, you need to unlearn that first. You need to understand that this," he gestured to the gym, to the open space around them, "is safe. No one is going to hurt you here." Elias took a shaky breath, then nodded. "Okay, show me again." They spent an hour working on basic blocks and strikes. Elias was clumsy, his movements jerky and uncertain, but there was something cathartic about it. Every punch he threw was a tiny rebellion against the years of helplessness, a step toward reclaiming the agency that had been stolen from him. Dante appeared in the doorway halfway through the session, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. He watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When Elias caught his eye, he didn't look away. Instead, he smiled. A small, approving smile that made something warm unfurl in Elias's chest. "Not bad," Dante said when Elias finally stopped to catch his breath. "You've got good instincts." "Instincts I never knew I had," Elias admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Trauma can do that. It buries parts of you." Dante pushed off from the doorframe and walked toward him. "But they're still there. They just need to be uncovered." He was close now. Close enough that Elias could smell the familiar scent of cedar and rain, undercut by something warmer, something that made his omega instincts pulse with interest. He looked up at Dante, his heart suddenly racing for a reason that had nothing to do with fear. "Thank you," Elias said softly, "for giving me the chance to find them." Dante's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping to Elias's lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back up. You don't need to thank me, Tesoro. I'm just glad you're here. The word hung between them. Tesoro. Treasure. Elias swallowed hard. I'm glad I'm here too. The weeks turned into months. Elias's body healed, the bruises fading to pale scars that would eventually disappear entirely. But the deeper wounds, the ones carved into his psyche by 3 years of abuse, took longer. There were nights when he woke up screaming, thrashing in the silk sheets of his guest room, terrified that the heavy footsteps in the hallway belonged to Marcus. But every time the door opened, it wasn't Marcus. It was Dante. He would sit in the armchair in the corner of Elias's room, reading a book under a dim lamp, a silent, immovable guardian. He never pushed Elias. He never demanded gratitude or affection. He simply existed in the space, a reminder that Elias was no longer alone. Sometimes, when the nightmares were particularly bad, Dante would set aside his book and simply talk, his low voice soothing Elias back to sleep. He would tell stories about his childhood, about his sister, about the time he had gotten lost in the Italian countryside and been rescued by a kind farmer's wife. The stories were mundane, but they grounded Elias, reminded him that there was a world beyond the fear. It started with quiet breakfasts on the terrace, overlooking the heavily wooded grounds. The morning air was crisp and cold, and Elias would wrap himself in a thick cashmere blanket while Dante sipped his espresso and read the newspaper. They didn't always talk, but the silence was comfortable, a far cry from the tense, oppressive quiet of Marcus's penthouse. It evolved into late-night conversations by the fireplace in Dante's study, where Elias learned that the ruthless underboss was also a brilliant strategist, a man who preferred leverage over bloodshed, and who carried the weight of a violent empire with a weary, calculating mind. He talked about his family, his uncle, who had built the Rossi syndicate from nothing, his mother, who had died when he was young, his sister, who had married a diplomat and moved to Europe to escape the life. I was supposed to be a lawyer, Dante admitted one night, staring into the flames. That was the plan. Go to law school, become a corporate attorney, leave all this behind. But then my uncle got sick, and the other families started circling. Someone had to step up. He shrugged, a gesture that was almost dismissive. So here I am. You could have walked away, Elias said softly. Dante turned to look at him, his eyes unreadable. Could I? This life, Elias, it doesn't let go. You think you can leave, but the past has a way of catching up. I've seen it happen. Men who tried to go straight, who thought they could escape the shadows. They always end up dead or in prison. He paused, his gaze sharpening. The only way out is through. You have to own it. Control it. Make it yours. And is that what you've done? Dante smiled. A slow, dangerous smile that made Elias's heart flutter. I'm working on it. Then, there was the trial. Marcus Sterling's downfall was the media spectacle of the decade. The evidence Dante had anonymously provided to the federal prosecutors was airtight. The financial fraud alone was enough for 20 years, but the conspiracy to commit murder bumped the sentence to life without the possibility of parole. The newspapers ran headline after headline, each one more salacious than the last. The Golden Couple of Chicago was revealed to be a house of cards, built on lies and violence. Elias attended the sentencing in federal court. He wore a tailored black suit, his hair styled immaculately, his posture rigid and unbreakable. Dante sat 2 rows behind him, flanked by his men, a silent shadow of absolute authority. The courtroom was packed with reporters, all of them hungry for a glimpse of the man who had brought down one of Chicago's most prominent citizens. When Marcus was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to his waist, he looked hollowed out. His hair was thinning, his eyes sunken and darting with paranoid terror. He looked at Elias, desperate for a shred of the timid, broken Omega he had controlled. Instead, Elias met his gaze with eyes as cold and dead as the bottom of Lake Michigan. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply smiled. A sharp, chilling smile that made Marcus physically recoil. He realized in that agonizing moment that Elias wasn't just surviving. He had transcended him. The trial lasted 4 days. The evidence was damning. Audio recordings, financial documents, witness testimony from the mechanic in Skokie, who had been paid to tamper with Arthur Pendleton's brakes. When the verdict was read, Marcus collapsed, his screams filling the courtroom. Elias watched him being dragged away, his expression serene. He felt nothing but a cold, satisfying emptiness where the fear used to be. Later that evening, the Rossi estate was quiet. Elias stood on the balcony of the master's study, a glass of vintage Barolo in his hand, watching the snow begin to fall over the dense forest perimeter. The wind was biting, but he barely felt it. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, too many to name. The heavy oak door behind him clicked open, and Dante stepped out onto the balcony. The chill winter air swirled around his dark suit, carrying the familiar scent of cedar and rain. "The warden at Marion Supermax owes my uncle a favor," Dante murmured, stepping up beside him. His shoulder brushed against Elias's. "Marcus is being placed in general population. He won't last a year." Elias took a slow sip of the wine, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. "He'll live every day of that year in absolute terror." "That's enough." Dante looked at him, his icy blue eyes catching the dim light from the study. "You look beautiful in black, Tesoro," he said softly. "But I think you'd look even better out of it." Elias's breath caught. It was the first time Dante had said anything overtly suggestive, and the impact was electric. He felt his cheeks flush, his pulse quickening. "Dante, I'm not going to push you." Dante set down his glass and turned to face him fully, his expression serious. "I'm not Marcus. I'm not going to take anything from you that you don't want to give. But I need you to know how I feel about you." He reached out, his hand cupping Elias's jaw with breathtaking gentleness. "I have wanted you since the moment I saw you in that cathedral. Not as a prize, not as a conquest, as mine. As someone who stands beside me, not beneath me." Elias's heart pounded. He leaned into Dante's touch, his eyelids fluttering. "I don't want to be your charity case, Dante. I don't want to be protected in a tower." Dante's eyes blazed with a fierce, hungry light. "Then what do you want?" Elias reached up, his hand covering Dante's. "I want to be your partner. I want to rule alongside you. I want to be someone who doesn't just survive, someone who fights." Dante's breath hitched, the raw power of his words breaking the last of his restraint. He pulled Elias against his chest, his mouth crashing down on his with a fierce, consuming hunger. It wasn't the tentative kiss of a savior. It was the claiming of an equal. Elias kissed him back with equal ferocity, his hands tangling in Dante's dark hair, burying the ghost of his past in the ashes of the empire they were going to build together. The kiss was desperate, hungry, full of all the words they had never spoken. Elias could feel Dante's heart pounding against his chest, could feel the Alpha's hands splaying across his back, pulling him impossibly closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against Elias's. "I've wanted that for so long," he admitted, his voice ragged. "Then why did you wait?" Elias whispered. "Because you needed to heal," Dante said simply. "Because I wanted you to choose me. Not because you had no other option, but because you wanted to." Elias smiled, a real smile, the kind he hadn't worn in years. "I'm choosing you, Dante. I'm choosing this." The months that followed were a revelation. Elias threw himself into learning everything he could about the Rossi Empire. The business, the politics, the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that kept the underworld running. Dante taught him everything, patiently answering his endless questions, never treating him like a burden. Elias discovered that he had a natural aptitude for strategy, for reading people and anticipating their moves. It was like architecture, in a way, understanding the structure of power, the load-bearing walls, the points of weakness. Elias also continued his self-defense training, pushing himself harder and harder. The bruises were gone, replaced by lean muscle and a newfound confidence. He could disarm an attacker now, could throw a punch that would make Enzo proud. The ghost of Elias Miller faded, and Elias Rossi reemerged, forged in fire and tempered by steel. The dynamic between him and Dante shifted subtly. They became partners in truth, not just in name. Elias sat in on meetings, his sharp intellect earning him respect from even the most hardened of Dante's lieutenants. He offered strategic advice, pointed out flaws in plans, and slowly but surely, he carved out a place for himself in the family. The other men, at first skeptical, began to see him as more than just Dante's Omega. He was a force in his own right, and they respected that. And Dante looked at him like he was the sun. His icy blue eyes softened whenever Elias entered a room, and his scent, when Elias was near, carried notes of warmth and contentment. He found himself seeking out Elias's presence, craving the quiet moments they shared. He would find excuses to be near him, to touch him, to breathe in the scent of him. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with a rival family, Dante found Elias in the library, reading by the fire. He crossed the room, settling into the armchair across from him, and watched him in silence. "You're staring," Elias said without looking up from his book. "I'm admiring," Dante corrected. "There's a difference." Elias closed the book, a slow smile spreading across his face. "And what exactly are you admiring?" Dante leaned forward, his eyes dark with intent. "Everything. The way you hold yourself now. The way you command a room. The way you're not afraid to look me in the eye and tell me when I'm wrong." He paused, his voice dropping. "The way you've taken everything they threw at you and turned it into strength." Elias set the book aside, his heart racing. "I learned from the best." "You learned from yourself," Dante said firmly. "I just gave you the space to find it." 6 months after the trial, Elias stood on the balcony of the master's study, watching the first snowfall of the season blanket the forest. The wind was biting, but he barely felt it. His focus was on the man behind him, the man who had walked through his penthouse door and given him back his life. Dante stepped up beside him, his arm sliding around Elias's waist. "You're thinking too loud," he murmured, pressing a kiss to his temple. "I'm thinking about how different everything is," Elias said softly. "A year ago, I was begging to die on a marble floor. And now," he looked out at the snow-covered grounds, at the sprawling estate that had become his home. "Now I'm here." Dante turned him gently, cupping his face in both hands. "Where you belong," he said firmly. "With me. Always." Elias's lips curved into a slow, radiant smile. "Always," he agreed. Dante kissed him, long and deep, and Elias melted into it. He could feel the alpha's warmth, his strength, his unwavering presence. He could smell the familiar scent of cedar and rain, interwoven with something new, contentment, love, a promise of forever. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the snow fall. Elias felt a peace he had never known, a sense of belonging that no amount of wealth or status could ever replicate. It was a feeling of being truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. "I love you, Dante," he whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. Dante went still. Then, slowly, he pulled back just enough to look into Elias's eyes. His expression was fierce, vulnerable, utterly unguarded. "I love you too, Tesoro. More than I ever thought I could love anything." Elias's heart swelled. "Then let's build something together. Something no one can tear down." Dante smiled. A real smile. One that transformed his sharp features into something almost boyish. "I would like nothing more." A year after that night in the penthouse, Elias Rossi stood in a different room. Not a penthouse, not a fortress, a courthouse. But this time, he wasn't the victim. He was the witness. The evidence that Dante had gathered had not only put Marcus away for life, it had exposed a network of corruption that reached all the way to City Hall. The backlash was seismic. The real estate market, already fragile, cratered. But the Rossi family, with their diversified holdings and careful planning, weathered the storm. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page story, "The Rise of the Rossi Empire." The article mentioned Elias by name, calling him the architect of the family's strategic expansion. It noted his background in architecture, his keen eye for design, his ability to turn failing properties into profitable ventures. It painted a picture of a man who had risen from tragedy to power. Elias read the article in the study, a smile playing on his lips. Dante appeared behind him, wrapping his arms around his shoulders and reading over his head. The architect of the Rossi Empire, Dante murmured, his breath warm against Elias's ear. I like that. I like the fact that they don't mention Marcus, Elias said, setting the paper aside. It's like he never existed. Dante's arms tightened around him. He doesn't matter anymore, Tesoro. He's a ghost. And ghosts can't hurt you. Elias turned in his arms, tilting his face up to meet Dante's gaze. No, they can't. He reached up, his fingers tracing the sharp line of Dante's jaw. You know what I'd like to do tonight? Dante's eyes darkened with interest. Tell me. Elias's smile was slow, wicked, full of promise. Celebrate. Dante captured his lips in a kiss that was hungry, claiming, full of all the heat and desire they had been building for months. Elias kissed him back with equal fervor, his hands fisting in Dante's shirt, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and Elias felt his knees go weak. They stumbled up the stairs, shedding clothes along the way, their mouths never parting. When they finally collapsed onto the massive bed in the master suite, Elias surrendered to the moment, not with fear, but with trust. Dante was gentle and demanding in equal measure, his touch both reverent and possessive. He took his time, worshipping every inch of Elias's body, learning the places that made him moan and the places that still needed to be handled with care. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the silk sheets, the fire casting dancing shadows across the walls. Elias rested his head on Dante's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. It was the most peaceful he had ever felt. 3 years ago, I was begging to die, Elias said softly. And now you're the queen of the underworld, Dante finished, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. How's that for a plot twist? Elias laughed, a real laugh, the kind he hadn't thought he was capable of. It's not bad, I suppose. Not bad. Dante propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at Elias with mock indignation. I'll have you know, I've been working on this redemption arc for months. The least you could do is be impressed. Elias reached up, tracing the lines of Dante's face. I'm impressed. I'm grateful. And he paused, searching for the right word. Happy. I'm happy, Dante. I didn't think I'd ever feel that again. Dante's expression softened, the mock outrage fading into something genuine and warm. That's all I ever wanted for you, Tesoro. Happiness. Safety. A future. Elias pulled him down into a kiss, soft and sweet. Then let's make that future together. 2 years later, the Rossi estate was abuzz with activity. It was the annual Christmas Gala, an event that had become the talk of Chicago's elite society. The guest list was a who's who of power brokers, politicians, and business magnates, all of them connected, one way or another, to the Rossi Empire. Elias stood at the top of the grand staircase, surveying the crowd below. He was dressed in a stunning crimson suit, the color a deliberate nod to the power he now commanded. Dante stood beside him, resplendent in black, his hand resting at the small of Elias's back. Ready, Tesoro? Dante murmured. Elias took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. Ready. They descended the stairs together, a united front of absolute power. The crowd parted before them, the whispers and murmurs rising like a tide. Elias met their gazes with a steady, unblinking stare. He wasn't the timid, broken Omega who had been dragged out of a penthouse 2 years ago. He was something else entirely, something forged in the fires of hell and tempered in the blood of his enemies. Dante leaned in, his lips brushing Elias's ear. Look at you, he whispered. You're magnificent. Elias smiled, a slow, dangerous smile that made more than a few people in the crowd shift nervously. I learned from the best. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and the crowd surged around them, eager to offer congratulations, to curry favor, to bask in the reflected glory of the Rossi Empire. Elias played the game flawlessly, charming, witty, utterly in control. He knew exactly how to make people feel important, how to extract information without seeming to pry, how to build alliances that would serve the family for years to come. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the estate was quiet, they retreated to their study. Dante poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handing one to Elias. "To us," Dante said, raising his glass. Elias clinked his against Dante's. "To us. And to the empire we're building." Dante's eyes blazed with a fierce, hungry light. "I'd follow you anywhere, Tesoro. To the ends of the earth and beyond." Elias leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to Dante's lips. "Good, because I'm not planning on stopping anytime soon." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the fire crackling in the hearth. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a soft, pristine white. Inside, there was only warmth and love and the unshakable certainty that they would face whatever came next together. Elias had spent 3 years bleeding in a golden cage, begging for a savior. But the man who finally walked through the door hadn't given him salvation. He had given him an empire and the strength to rule it. And Elias Rossi was ready to reign. He had found his place in the world, not despite the darkness, but because of it. He had learned that strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it. He had learned that love wasn't weakness, but the most powerful force of all. And he had learned that sometimes the devil you knew wasn't the one who wanted to save you. Sometimes the devil was the only one who could. As Dante pulled him closer, Elias closed his eyes and let himself be held. He thought about his father, about the kind, honest man who had taught him that justice mattered. He thought about the man who had taken that from him, who had tried to destroy everything he loved. And he thought about the man who had given it all back, who had shown him that sometimes justice came from the most unexpected places. He opened his eyes and looked up at Dante. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't come that night?" Dante's expression grew serious. "Every day? It's the reason I do what I do. It's the reason I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Elias smiled. "You don't have to protect me, Dante. I can protect myself now. I know you can." Dante brushed a strand of hair from Elias's face. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying." And Elias, for the first time in his life, believed that he was truly safe.